we've just come off the back of a really moving interview. I know that you guys were both very moved by it as well. And we were sort of talking about how it is important, isn't it, to sort of humanise politicians as well.
Absolutely, and I think it's that thing. It's kind of understanding that our politicians are people who sometimes go through horrible forms of grief as well. I think it's sometimes a useful reminder, given all the abuse they get and, the rightful scrutiny and accountability, which can be really robust. I think it's sometimes good to remember they're people too. But also there is such a terrible stigma still around miscarriage, and it's a very kind of particular, painful form of grief, I think, that we're starting to get better as a society at talking about. But I think there's probably still some way to go yet.
Yeah, and I do think that it's wonderful that guys talking about it, because it can't be easy at all. But, that interview is going to prompt conversations. That interview might sort of help somebody going through a similar experience or help other people understand what those experiences are. So I think a really great interview to do.
Yeah, I was really happy that he would come to one to share his story. And he did, like you say, you could tell... you could tell by the way he was in the interview how impacted he clearly still felt by it. And also, I guess, this is what Westminster at its best, isn't it? When you have people who've gone through something like that, life-changing, you'll never get over it. As he says, you just learn to live with it rather than moving on from it.
Yeah.
And you can use your experience to think, hang on, why don't we have better leave, for example, for people who've gone through losing a child or a baby? This should happen, and then actually use their position to make a change.
No, absolutely.
And quite often on these sorts of issues, it goes cross-party as well, which I think is a useful reminder that, despite our politics, which can be very toxic at times, there are some issues, actually, which politicians from different values and different political traditions can find common ground.
Yeah. Really difficult subject to talk about. And I know, we're all getting, it's difficult to watch and stuff. So, we can talk a little bit more about some of the other stories that we covered on the programme today. The big sort of announcement this morning was about child sexual exploitation and to try and get basically a duty for people to report if they've got any concerns about particular children, because we've seen very vulnerable kids in particular being targeted, right?
Absolutely, and it is really important. So we had the independent inquiry on child sexual abuse, which reported last year after many, many years of work. I think it's important to say it looked at all forms of child sexual abuse in society, so in institutions, grooming gangs, but also in the home. And actually, the sort of child sexual abuse that goes on in the home, it is more common than we'd like to think. And it's really taboo. All forms of child sexual abuse are very taboo. And that gets in the way of it being reported, dealt with. So much of it is preventable, but we sort of leave children to suffer. So I think it's really good to see that the Home Secretary is taking one of the recommendations of that independent inquiry last year. My concern about this announcement, which is basically putting a legal duty on professionals who work with children to report suspicions of child sexual abuse, my concern about it is that it puts a lot of emphasis on the law as an instrument of change and makes it sound like, this stuff isn't getting reported because, they're not legally obliged to do it. Whereas actually, if you look at the research on this, we know that, it's very, very taboo in society, which means that social workers, teachers, etc., they can be quite reluctant to identify it as a form of suspected abuse because they know what it might mean for a family in a school.
And I guess if you get it wrong, then
absolutely,
it's going to have consequences.
There's not enough training around it for, even social workers get quite limited training on child sexual abuse, what the signs to watch for are. So the idea that you can just fix it with a change in the law is, I think, wrong. And I think we've got so much to do as a society to think about, well, how do we keep, how do professionals working with children really keep their eyes and ears peeled for some of the signs of child sexual abuse? Because it is preventable. Yeah. There are signs and children can be taken out of those situations and supported, but too many children are being left to kind of suffer this awful crime alone.
I do think that the interesting thing here is that you can put something down as a statute and a duty, but ultimately, are you going to be able to pull the system together in terms of resourcing and, these cultural issues and training that you've just mentioned, Sonia, about, to get what you want as the outcome? So, it's all that stuff that we're so used to in Westminster, is that the announcement is there, you know that the press release has gone out, but actually the follow-through is going to require years of effort to make this actually work.
Yeah, because it is so difficult, like you say. And actually, it's interesting because, I'm always one of these people who I think if we're talking about crimes that are predominantly impacting women and girls, we should call that out and say it is. But I was quite pleased, actually, Lisa and Andy was like, actually, there's a lot of boys that this impacts as well.
Yes.
And this can be even more taboo and more difficult. Maybe not, but you know, it can be very difficult for those boys
it's so taboo. It's so difficult for children to talk about and raise their hand and say that something's happening to them, which is why it's so important that everyone who works with children is aware of some of the signs of it and feels comfortable reporting it, investigating it. But we definitely have a child protection system at the moment where it is too taboo, even amongst professionals working with children. So, you know, that's why we're not able to do what we should be doing for these children.
You spoke a bit about in Westminster where you get the press release out, but it's the follow-through that matters. And I just think this really applies to some of the policies around immigration as well. Because with the interview today, you know, I was trying to... There's so much you can ask the Home Secretary about, right? So you're kind of like thinking, OK, can do this, police, the announcement today, you've got immigration, how do you whittle it all down? And I could have made the decision, I guess, not to focus too much on Rwanda because it hasn't happened, right? Like, no one's been sent there. And I do still have a bit of scepticism about whether it is going to happen at all because of the delays. I don't know what your sort of take is on it.
Well, I think that there's so much that is going on behind the scenes. So as a former Home Office Special Advisor, you know, my sympathy tends to be with, you know, the difficulty of what you need to do. And the Home Secretary's remit is so broad, you know, at any given moment, she's probably got sort of 8 crises going on that we're not even aware of. So, you know, I have some sympathy for that. What I think is interesting is that you go big. So, you know, like the Prime Minister at the beginning of the year has said, we're going to deal with the small boat stuff. But then actually following through with that then becomes difficult because there are challenges that will come your way that you probably didn't expect or the ones that you did expect or, you know, whatever, you know, tone that takes is challenging. So I do think that there is a limit to what you can actually say as kind of, you know, a running narrative before you actually get to a point where either something is fixed or it's really obvious that it's not going to be.
I mean, she said be judged on the record, and she will be, right?
Yeah, I mean, she's really holding herself hostage to fortune there because, I mean, I agree with you, Sophie. I think it's a completely unworkable plan. Experts have looked at it. There are so many holes in it, whether it's kind of international law, whether it's the practicalities of where do you detain people arriving in the UK. I mean, detention is much, much more expensive than housing asylum seekers. We've got nowhere to do that. You know, Rwanda, the agreement with Rwanda is to take, you know, what is effectively a small handful of you know, the people who are arriving on small boats. Where are the rest going to go? I mean, it's just totally not worked out. And I can't help think that if you were a Home Secretary that was genuinely interested in addressing the issue around an increasing volume of asylum claims, but it's not the highest it's ever been at the moment. It is high, but it's not the highest it's ever been. Lots of countries are seeing an increase. What you would do is focus on making the asylum system more humane, but also more robust. So you would process... Lots of these people are genuine asylum seekers who are fleeing terrible conflict, you know, from regions like Afghanistan, where Britain has been involved. You know, you would look at their claims, you would assess them fairly and quickly. So people who've got a legitimate claim to be here can get a job, can work, for example, can start a new life. But people who don't have a legitimate claim, you deport. And you deal with that. At the moment, people who are genuine asylum seekers, people who suffered the most awful kinds of torture and human rights abuses, are trapped in a system where it takes months, even years to process our application. That's not humane, it's not fair to them, and it's not fair in terms of the system, in terms, you know, there are people here who could be deported. And
I think that's slightly in contention, though. I think if you're looking at it from her perspective, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, I think the issue is how many of the people that are coming over via this route, small boats route, are genuine asylum seekers. Now, I'm not saying one way or another, but I think there has to be better numbers that are published because the contention from the Home Office is that actually you're getting a lot of people who are coming over that are economic migrants, and I think there should be much better numbers and data about that.
Yeah, but if you look at the countries from which they're coming, you know, the top 5 countries in terms of asylum claims are countries where we know that there's a very high success rate.
Although Albania is top, where
in terms of small boat arrivals, not in terms of the general.
Albania, I think, is top of small boat arrivals.
Yes, exactly, small boat. But if you look at the overall asylum system, the top 5 countries, which include small boats arrival, but you're right, there's a different statistic. But even with Albania, so there's a lot of claims made that this is, you know, these are the only way you can figure this out out is by processing and assessing.
And getting better data.
There are genuine, because we have a massive human trafficking problem across Europe that actually affects women and girls, women being, trafficked for sex work, essentially, prostitution. So, I think it suits the Home Secretary to be able to make claims without evidence about the invalidity of claims.
We are out of time. It is such a hot issue. We could be talking about it all morning. Thank you so much for coming on the programme today. Great to talk to you both on the show today.